The axe head split on the fourth swing. Not chipped. Not loosened at the handle collar, the way axe heads loosened when the wood dried and shrank, and the fit went soft. It split, a clean diagonal fracture running from the pole to the cutting edge that separated the head into two pieces and sent the lower half spinning into the woodpile with enough force to scatter 3 days of split pine across the frozen ground. Virgil Cutter stood holding the handle with half an axe head still attached, and looked at what remained of his woodpile and did the arithmetic that a man does when the arithmetic is not in his favor, and he knows it. 43 pieces of split pine, maybe 2 days of heat if he burned carefully. 3 days if he burned like a man who was not afraid of the cold, which Virgil was not, but his wife Sera was. And Sera's fear of cold was not irrational, because Sera was 7 months pregnant, and the nearest doctor was in Bozeman, 31 miles northeast across a Gallatin Valley, locked under 2 feet of snow since the second week of October. It was November 3rd. He looked at the sky, flat and low, the color of an old tin plate, carrying the specific weight of a sky that has more snow in it, and is considering when to let it go. A new axe head from Gallatin City cost $1.80. He had $3.40. The round trip meant an overnight stay, feed for the horse, a meal. $1 he did not have. He set the broken handle against the fence post and went inside. Sera sat at the table with her hands around a tin cup, her eyes on him the way a woman's eyes are on a man, when she has already assessed the situation and is waiting to see whether his assessment matches hers. She was 26, broad-shouldered, with the physical competence of a woman raised on a Wisconsin dairy farm where work did not stop because the weather was bad. She had crossed to Montana territory the previous spring behind a husband who had promised her good soil and a working stove. She had received both. Now she sat watching him come inside without enough firewood to last the week. He told her about the axe. She nodded once and looked at the stove. The firebox had 3 splits burning at a rate that would empty it in 4 hours. Without getting up, she reached across and adjusted the damper to 1/4 open in a motion so practiced it required no thought. The draw dropped. The burn rate dropped with it. They bought another hour from those 3 splits, without either of them saying a word. Virgil sat down and put the broken axe head on the table between them. They had been in the Gallatin Valley 7 months and had made the specific mistakes of people who are competent in one environment and transfer that competence to a different one without accounting for the differences. Virgil had homesteaded in Indiana 4 years before Montana. Indiana winters were cold. Montana winters were a different category of event that used the same word for reasons Virgil considered, sitting at that table, to be actively misleading. He had cut what he calculated was sufficient firewood for an Indiana winter, working through August and September with the axe that had just broken, splitting and stacking with the efficiency of a man who trusts his own judgment. The stack had looked substantial in September. It looked, from where he sat in early November, like a problem he should have started solving in July. The coal was Sera's idea. She had seen it in September along the cut bank of the creek running the claim's southern boundary, a black seam running horizontally through the exposed earth, maybe 8 inches thick, sitting between 2 layers of gray shale at a height she could reach without climbing. She had mentioned it to Virgil at supper, and Virgil had said it was lignite, low-grade coal, the kind Indiana homesteaders called black dirt, and considered more trouble than it was worth. Sera had said she understood and had not mentioned it again. She mentioned it now. The seam was 40 yards from the cabin. She did not know how much heat lignite produced relative to lodgepole pine, or how to burn it in a wood stove. But it was 40 yards away, and the nearest axe head was 31 miles away, and those two facts seemed relevant to the current situation. Virgil looked at the broken axe head on the table. He was 31 years old. He had been wrong about the firewood, and they were both sitting with that knowledge in the specific silence of two people who have been married long enough to understand that assigning fault is a luxury that cold weather does not permit. He asked how thick she thought the seam was. She said 8 inches, running at least 20 feet along the bank face. Virgil did the arithmetic and arrived at a number larger than 2 days of split pine. He asked if they had an iron pry bar. She got up and got it from the corner without a word. The seam was better than Sera remembered. Not 8 inches. 14. She had measured it in September from a standing position looking across the creek bed, which had compressed the view. Up close with Virgil holding the lantern against the cut bank in the gray November morning light, the black seam ran a full 14 inches between its shale layers, dense and dull-surfaced, with the specific lack of reflectivity that distinguished lignite from surrounding gray rock, the way a bruise distinguishes itself from healthy skin. It ran the full 20 feet of exposed bank face and continued under soil, overburden, at least 10 feet north and 15 feet south. He drove the pry bar into the seam face and levered. The lignite did not come out in clean blocks, the way good bituminous coal came out of a properly worked seam. It came out in irregular chunks and crumbling fragments, some of it powdering entirely on extraction. This was the behavior that had made Indiana homesteaders dismiss it as not worth the effort. What those homesteaders had possessed that Virgil currently did not was a functional axe and a standing woodpile, and the absence of those two things changed the arithmetic of effort considerably. Sera carried. She filled 2 grain sacks methodically, picking chunks from the creek gravel with both hands, working from a crouch that her pregnancy made uncomfortable after the first 20 minutes, but which she maintained without comment. By the time Virgil's arms gave out, they had 2 full grain sacks and a pile of loose fragments that Sera swept into a third partial sack with a flat piece of shale. They carried it back in 3 trips. Virgil stacked the chunks beside the stove and looked at them. Irregular, dirty, already crumbling at the edges and shedding black dust on the cabin floor. The pile did not look like fuel. It looked like rubble pulled from a stream bed. He picked up the largest intact chunk, roughly the size of a man's doubled fist, maybe 3 pounds, and turned it over in his hands. A mine surveyor passing through Gallatin City in summer had told him lignite ran 60 to 70% of bituminous coal's heat value per pound, roughly 40 to 50% of seasoned lodgepole pine, which meant he needed twice the weight of lignite to match pine heat. The 2 full grain sacks represented perhaps a day and a half of equivalent warmth. Still better than 43 splits and a broken axe. The first burn failed. He loaded 4 chunks into the firebox and touched a match to dry pine shavings. The shavings caught. The lignite did not. He held a pine splinter directly to the lignite face for 40 seconds until it burned to his fingers. The surface charred slightly and produced a thin thread of smoke that disappeared when he pulled the flame away. Sera watched from the table and said nothing. Virgil sat back on his heels and thought about what the surveyor had said. Lignite required an established coal bed to ignite, not a quick open flame, but a sustained high-temperature base that brought the coal surface up to ignition point gradually. Industrial boiler practice. But the physical principle did not change with scale. He counted the remaining pine splits. 31. He took 6 and built a full pine fire, running it hot with the damper 3/4 open for 40 minutes until the firebox back wall glowed and the stovepipe was too hot to touch. Then he placed 4 lignite chunks directly onto the pine coal bed, flat faces against the coals, shut the door, set the damper to half, and waited. 12 minutes later, the dropping stovepipe temperature stopped dropping. 14 minutes in, it began to rise. The lignite had caught. Not with pine's quick, bright combustion. It burned from the inside out, a deep red glow building in the coal's interior that spread slowly across the surface over the next 20 minutes until the entire piece was engaged, radiating a dense, sustained heat that was different in quality from pine. Heavier, more persistent. The heat of a material compressed for 10,000 years, releasing that compression slowly and completely. The stovepipe temperature climbed past the point where the pine fire alone had taken it, and held there steady without fluctuation. Virgil sat on the floor against the wall and felt the heat move through the cast-iron door in a steady, even wave. Sera came and sat beside him, hands folded across her stomach. Outside the Gallatin Valley delivered the snow it had been holding for 3 days. She asked him how long it would burn. He said they would find out by morning. He said he was going to need a better pry bar. The lignite burned for 9 hours. Virgil checked the stovepipe temperature at midnight, at 3, and at first light. It dropped across those intervals the way a long burn drops, gradually, without the sudden collapse that marked a pine fire burning through its last split and going cold. At 6 in the morning, the firebox still held a deep red coal bed, shrunk to half its original volume, but not gone, and 4 fresh chunks caught in 8 minutes without any pine starter at all. He wrote the number 9 in the seed catalog margin, then 8 underneath it, his conservative estimate. Then he looked at the creek bank through the frost-hazed window and did new arithmetic. The exposed seam face was 20 feet of running length at 14 inches depth. The surveyor had said Gallatin Valley lignite typically ran 8 to 12 feet of horizontal depth before pinching against sandstone. 8 feet by 14 inches by 20 feet translated, at lignite's approximate density, to somewhere between 4 and 6 tons of recoverable fuel within 40 yards of his front door. 4 tons at 9 hours per firebox load was a number so much larger than his remaining pine supply that he stopped calculating and put the seed catalog down. He woke Sera at 7 and told her. She listened with her eyes still half closed and her hands on her stomach, and when he finished, she asked 2 questions: whether the smoke was clean enough for the cabin, and whether the pry bar would hold for serious extraction work. Both were the right questions, and Virgil had been thinking about both since midnight. The smoke carried a faint mineral edge, but was not accumulating in the cabin air. The ceiling showed no blue haze of incomplete combustion venting back into the room. Acceptable by Montana territory. November standards, which was the only standard currently available. The pry bar was 5/8 inch fence post iron, adequate for leverage but too light for sustained work against a shale-bound seam. It would bend before the winter was out. He needed a mine bar. Full inch diameter, 5 feet long, chisel point one end, tamping flat the other. $1.20 at the Gallatin City Trading Post. He had $3.40. He rode to Gallatin City that afternoon on a horse he pushed harder than he liked across snow-covered ground, because the window between the current weather and the next front was narrow, and he could feel it in the air. He bought the mine bar, a box of matches, and 2 pounds of dried beans, and rode home in failing light, with the 5-foot bar lashed across the saddle in front of him, its weight shifting with every stride, in a way that kept the horse irritable and attentive for the full 15 miles. The mine bar changed everything. Where the fence post iron had levered out crumbling fragments, the chisel point drove into the shale joint and popped out intact slabs that held together through handling and stacked cleanly beside the stove. Virgil developed a technique over 6 days. Chisel into the upper shale joint, full body weight on the bar, a short, sharp downward pulse that fractured the contact without pulverizing the coal. Then the flat end reversed to lever the slab outward. Pieces 8 to 10 inches across, 2 to 3 inches thick, burning the full 9 hours without adjustment. Sera kept the fire. Virgil extracted and carried. Sera managed the burn. She learned the lignite's behavior faster than he had. The exact damper settings, different piece sizes required. The precise moment to add fresh coal to a diminishing bed without smothering it. By the 3rd week, she could read the stovepipe temperature by the pitch of the metal's thermal tick without touching the thermometer. She was doing this at 8 months pregnant in a Montana Territory November, and she did not mention it as remarkable because to Sera it was not remarkable. It was the work that needed doing, and she was the person available to do it. Their daughter was born on the 12th of December. Virgil delivered her himself because the snow on the 11th made the Bozeman road impassable, and the baby did not wait. The birth took 4 hours. The lignite bed held steady at full output from midnight to dawn without requiring attention, which meant Virgil's hands were free for the work that mattered, and the cabin did not drop below 52 degrees at any point in those 4 hours. He noted 52 in the seed catalog margin the following morning next to the 9 and the 8, and looked at the column of numbers for a moment. Then he went back to the creek bank with the mine bar. They burned lignite through January and into February. The pine woodpile stood untouched against the cabin wall, held in reserve for ignition starter and for the days when the creek drifted over. Those days were few. The seam gave what he asked every morning he put the bar to it: compressed black fuel that had been sitting in that cut bank since before any person had a name for the valley it ran through. The surveyor's railroad concern never came back to the Gallatin Valley. The lignite seams he had called marginal stayed in the ground unworked and largely unnoticed by the industry that had dismissed them. The homesteaders who paid attention to their creek banks that winter did not go cold. The ones who trusted Indiana logic about what was and was not worth the effort burned their furniture in February. Virgil Cutter did not burn a single piece of furniture. He burned what the land offered, and he stayed warm, and his daughter was born into a heated room and lived. And that was the complete arithmetic of that particular winter in the Gallatin Valley, and it did not require any further commentary.